Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to be walking through Activity 11-2 titled Creating and Testing a Dhcp Scope. This is from the MCSA Guide to Installing and Configuring Microsoft Windows Server 2012 R2. In my edition of the book, this activity begins at the bottom of page 501. So a little bit about the activity is that we have installed the DHCP role on our server, and we're going to go and configure it. Set it up to provide scopes and actually provide the DHCP service to the domain. In activity 11.1, this server was not part of the domain, so it was a standalone DHCP server. Towards the middle of that activity, 11.1, we joined the server to the domain. So I'm actually going to be picking up at the end of that activity, which is going to be to authorize this server as a domain DHCP server. I figured that was kind of an important part to add into this video, even though it's not part of activity 11.2. It's pretty important that this gets done. If you have DHCP installed and then join the domain, it won't automatically authorize that way. If you're not doing anything with the domain side, if you're not doing an Active Directory domain and you're just setting up a server, then it becomes pre-authorized or automatically authorized. Once you join it to the domain, it no longer has that authorization to operate on the domain as a domain DHCP server. So we're going to finish off activity 11.1 here by just authorizing the server. And it should prompt, I believe, for credentials, except I'm logged in. So I am logged in as the domain administrator. And so that's all it took, was a right click and then a left click to authorize it. So let me quickly look back over the end of activity 11.1. Alright. So since we see that it looks like everything's still down, we just need to do a refresh with the F5 key, or you can right click on the server node and refresh there. And now we see that it's authorized and available to configure to provide IP servicing to the network. So now we're actually at the beginning of activity 11-2. So we are going to be using this server, and I'm going to go ahead and get my Windows 8 machine started here. Alright, so from our server side, we want to go ahead and set up a new IPv4 scope. So we'll right click the IPv4 node and tell it to create a new scope, and it'll launch the wizard. This is fairly straightforward. The way you name these, usually I would recommend doing it by the scope itself. Depending on how your network is set up, you may name these based on building or department. It kind of depends on how your network has already been set up, unless you're starting from scratch, and then I would just recommend starting with the scope. So for example, we're going to be doing the 1010 scope, and this is just going to be the 1010 network. Okay, so our starting address, we actually have the full 10.10.1.0 through 10.10.1.255. I'm going to show you a little bit about exclusion ranges here. So there's a de facto exclusion range, which means that even though we have this full network, I'm not going to let DHCP assign anything below 100. So I've created a de facto exclusion for everything below 100. We'll go look at specific exclusion ranges where you can manually assign a small range. So our ending IP address is going to be 10.10.1.255. Our subnet mask, we're going to make that a 16 for the length, so 255.255.0.0. next. And so here we can set up a specific exclusion rule. The book tells you to go ahead and skip this. I'm going to go ahead and set up a small exclusion range here, and we're going to do like 245 to 250. And say I had maybe a couple of printers or something, or maybe I had like CEOs or an SFO or some higher person in management where I want to go ahead and make sure they have a static IP address. You know, I would make a small range like this for something like that. For the lease duration, this is, depending on your network, this could either be several days or it could be just an hour or two. In a large network where you generally see the same devices consistently, the same computers or laptops, your lease could be a little bit longer. When you go out to places that have public Wi-Fi like Starbucks or McDonald's, their lease times are probably very short because people come through so quickly that if an IP address was set aside for a device for 8 hours and the device is only there for 30 minutes, that's 7.5 hours that IP address is being held when it could be used for somebody else. So for this, we're going to set this just to an hour. Note that if you have anything set up for days and nothing on these, but you try to remove that day, it'll throw an error, usually saying, you know, you can't have a 0 lease. You have to have some kind of time increment in here. So we'll move on to the next. For these, we could go and take a look at those, but that's a lot of content for one video, so we're going to do those later. And then we'll go ahead and tell it to finish. And we see that when it's first created, it's not active. So once we create a scope, we need to come and activate it here. And that will allow our DHCP server to assign IP addresses from that scope as long as they aren't excluded. So we currently have nothing set up yet, and that's why we need our Windows 8 computer. And once it comes up, we'll take a look at setting the DNS and DHCP servers so that it will go and actually communicate with this DHCP server to get an address. A lot of the times, if you just leave their settings as the factory defaults, it will go and find a DHCP server correctly. But in some cases that may not work very well, and so if you do end up having any problems, you can always manually configure this to go and get the correct settings. Okay, so on our Windows 8, we can come take a quick look at its current IP settings, which I believe is set up for a static IP address. And our DNS is configured, so this is actually 410 server 1, so it's my first server with the full GUI. My alternate I have backing up over, looks like, to Google. Alright, so one way to test is to using the GUI is to just quickly switch this over to obtain an IP address automatically, and this will set it back to DHCP, and it will obtain the DHCP settings for these. These are some of the options that you can configure on the DHCP server, is to include a DNS address. So when this Windows 8 machine requests and receives an IP address from the DHCP server, the Windows 8 machine will also be configured to contact the correct DNS servers for the network. So let's go ahead and get out of those. And the book wants us using PowerShell. So Let's go ahead and open PowerShell up on the Windows 8 machine. And here's the command we're going to be using: set net IP interface. If I can type in here. It's being a little bit slow. Let's try that again. Set net IP interface with the interface alias Ethernet 0, as we saw. And if you ever need to figure out what the alias is and you have a GUI, you can open your Network and Sharing Center and it'll be right here. So the book says Ethernet. This machine is actually Ethernet 0. That will vary machine to machine. We want to tell it to be DHCP enabled. So we're going to go ahead and hit enter there, and that will reconfigure that interface to use DHCP. Alright, once that's completed, because we didn't set up a DNS option in the DHCP server, we're going to go ahead and manually do that here with this command: set DNS client server address, interface alias Ethernet 0, reset server, and so we're going to have it reconnect that. Reset. There we go. So now if we do an IP config, you see that it is picking up an automatic IP address. Well, that's definitely not right. There we go. So I had to force it to go and pick up an address again. It was receiving this automatic private IP address. I can tell that's definitely not my network. So by forcing it to renew, it went and picked up that first address that was available, 10.10.1.100, with the subnet 255.255, which is the 16-bit network subnet mask. And we see it did not pick up my DNS servers because they're not configured in the DHCP. So let's take a quick look at that. Where are my scope options? And so I don't want to go over all of these. I definitely don't want to go in depth, but you can come in here to set up a few things, like your router would be your default gateway, your time servers, your name servers, and your DNS servers. So I specifically want to give it a DNS server pointing back to my domain controller. And so we can go and quickly take a look. If we renew this again, it should pick up that DNS entry. And there it is. So that way it'll be set and configured on all of the devices on the network, rather than you having to go and manually set a DNS server entry to point back to your domain controller or wherever your DNS server is. So back to our server, I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and we'll take a look at our address leases, and now we see that Windows 8 machine is using that IP address. Looks like it will be expiring in about an hour, so it's about 11:37 now. So it'll be expiring in an hour, which is good. That's how we have it configured for a 1-hour lease time. So what if you have these configured on your DHCP server, but you're not seeing them on the computer end? You would want to check this entry right here to make sure that the machine itself is communicating with that DHCP server. Because if it can communicate, it should pull those options and settings down. Alright, so it looks like that's pretty much everything for this activity, and kind of a little bit of extra stuff in there. I hope everybody finds it useful. As always, please feel free to leave me comments or questions below, and I will try to reply in a timely fashion.